Professor Harold Jensen thought humiliating Alice Thompson would be easy. Little did he know, she was about to make him regret it instantly. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the classroom, casting a warm glow over the faces of students who eagerly awaited their next lecture. Professor Jensen, a man known for his sharp intellect and towering ego, stood at the front of the class, his silver glasses glinting as he surveyed the room. His voice, smooth and authoritative, filled the space as he prepared to dive into another complex theory. Today, we're going to test the limits of what we can solve. But, of course, some minds just aren't built for these challenges, he said with a smirk, his eyes scanning the room. Alice Thompson, seated in the back row, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She was the quiet type, always blending in, never seeking attention. But today, she was about to become the focus of Professor Jensen's cruel game. "Alice," the professor called out, his tone dripping with condescension. "Since you've been so quiet, let's see if you can solve this equation. It's a simple one, even for someone with your unique skill set." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Alice. A few snickers echoed from the front of the room. Alice could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her notebook, but she said nothing. This wasn't the first time she'd been humiliated like this, but something about the professor's tone cut deeper than usual. The students watched, their anticipation palpable. They were all waiting for her to fail. They were all waiting for the moment when Alice would crumble under the weight of their expectations. "Well," Professor Jensen prompted, his voice growing more impatient. Alice slowly rose from her seat, the eyes of every student on her, as if she were an exhibit in a zoo. She walked to the front of the room with a quiet, deliberate step. Her hands shook slightly as she approached the board, but she refused to let the fear show. The professor handed her the chalk, a smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Let's see if you can solve it, then," he said, his voice laced with mockery. The equation on the board seemed simple enough, but Alice could see the flaw. Her mind raced through the numbers, calculations flowing like second nature. She had been solving equations like this since she was a child, but no one knew that. No one knew about her late-night study sessions, her relentless pursuit of understanding. Alice stood in front of the chalkboard, her mind working faster than her hands could keep up. But when she moved to write the solution, there was no hesitation. Her chalk flew across the board with precision, each stroke deliberate and confident. She paused for a moment, stepped back, and surveyed her work. The silence in the room was deafening. Professor Jensen's smug expression faltered as he looked over her solution. The students behind him whispered among themselves, unsure of what they were seeing. "This can't be right," Professor Jensen muttered under his breath. His fingers traced the numbers on the board, but every calculation checked out. Alice had done it. She had solved the problem with ease, faster than anyone could have imagined. The students were stunned into silence. Even the professor, who had prided himself on his ability to humiliate students, was speechless. The class held its breath. And then, Alice spoke, her voice soft but cutting. "It seems the simplest problems are often the hardest for the most powerful minds to solve," she said. Her words hung in the air, a sharp contrast to the earlier mockery. Professor Jensen stood frozen, unable to respond. The room remained quiet, the power dynamic that had once been so clear now shattered in an instant. Alice had won, without raising her voice, without anger, just with the quiet strength of her intellect. As Alice stood at the front of the class, the tension in the air felt thick enough to cut with a knife. Professor Jensen stood frozen, staring at the chalkboard where Alice had just written the solution to what had been his impossible problem. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The students, who had been eagerly waiting for Alice to fail, now looked at her with wide eyes, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. The silence stretched, filling the room with an uncomfortable weight. Alice didn't move, standing calmly with her hands at her sides, as if she were waiting for something. The professor's face began to turn a shade of red, and the whispers in the room slowly grew louder as students murmured among themselves. How did you do that?" Professor Jensen finally managed to ask, his voice shaky. Alice simply smiled softly, the kind of smile that showed no hint of arrogance but still conveyed a quiet confidence. "I just paid attention," she said quietly, stepping back from the board. Her response left the room stunned. Alice turned to leave the front of the class, her footsteps echoing in the silence that had settled in the room. But as she reached the door, she heard the professor's voice again. "Alice, wait," he called out, his tone no longer filled with mockery, but something softer, more uncertain. Alice paused, but didn't turn around. She could feel his eyes on her, but she didn't let that shake her. "What is it, Professor?" she asked, her voice steady. There was a long pause before he spoke again. "I've never seen anything like that before," he said, his voice now tinged with a mix of awe and frustration. "You're not just some simple woman, are you?" The words were a clumsy attempt at an apology, but Alice didn't need it. She knew exactly what he was trying to say. She took a deep breath before answering, her voice calm and even. "I've always been more than what people see on the surface. Maybe you should stop underestimating people like me." With that, Alice walked out of the room, leaving the stunned professor behind. As she walked through the hallways of the university, she could feel the weight of the stares from students and staff alike, but it didn't bother her. She had known this moment would come, the moment when the people who had dismissed her would see her for what she truly was. Alice had never been the loudest person in the room, but today, her quiet strength had spoken louder than any words could. She had proven something not just to Professor Jensen, but to herself as well, that she didn't need to scream to be heard. She didn't need to show off her intelligence to make it known. It was enough to simply exist, to be herself, and let her actions speak for her. As she made her way to the campus exit, Alice couldn't help but smile. She had won, not with anger or bitterness, but with the calm confidence that had always been her true strength. As Alice walked out of the classroom, a sense of calm washed over her. She had expected a moment like this, but experiencing it was something else entirely. The silence in the room still echoed in her mind. The professor's stammering apology and the stunned faces of her classmates, it all felt so surreal. It wasn't the first time she had been underestimated, but today had been different. Today, she had proven something not just to them, but to herself. She had spent years learning to silence the voices that told her she wasn't enough, that her place was in the background. And now, here she was, standing in front of her peers, showing them what she was truly capable of. As Alice made her way down the hallway, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, expecting to see one of the students who had been in the class, but instead, it was Professor Jensen. He was walking toward her, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his usual confident stride replaced by a hesitant shuffle. For a moment, they stood there, facing each other in the quiet hallway. Alice could see the embarrassment in his eyes, the way he avoided her gaze. He had probably never had anyone challenge him so directly, let alone make him feel so small. "Alice," he said softly, his voice uncharacteristically humble. "I owe you an apology." Alice blinked, surprised by his words. She had expected him to dismiss the whole situation, to try and find some excuse to save face. But here he was, acknowledging his mistake. "I didn't realize who you were," he continued, his tone sincere. "I assumed that because you were quiet, you didn't have much to offer. But you proved me wrong, and for that, I'm sorry." Alice studied him for a moment, her mind racing. This wasn't the apology she had imagined. It wasn't grand or dramatic. It was simple, honest, and it felt real. She nodded slowly, her expression softening. "It's okay," she said, her voice calm. "I'm used to being underestimated." Professor Jensen looked at her with a mixture of respect and regret. "I shouldn't have judged you like that," he admitted. "You're a lot more than what I gave you credit for." Alice smiled faintly. "We all have our assumptions," she replied. "But sometimes, it's better to just listen and learn." The professor nodded, his shoulders loosening as if a weight had been lifted from them. "You're right," he said. "I'll try to keep that in mind from now on." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was no longer filled with tension, but with understanding. It was a small moment, but it felt significant. In a way, Alice had won more than just the challenge in the classroom. She had earned something far more valuable: respect. She didn't need to prove herself with words. Her actions had done all the talking. As they stood there in the hallway, the distant sound of students chatting and moving through the building seemed to fade away. For Alice, the moment was hers. She had reclaimed her place in the world, not by fighting back, but by showing up, by being true to herself. And that, in the end, was all that really mattered. The next few days at the university were different for Alice. It wasn't that anyone treated her any differently. She was still the quiet woman in the back of the classroom, but something had shifted. There was an unspoken recognition in the air. Professor Jensen had taken the first step, but the ripple effects were felt by others as well. When Alice entered the classroom the following Monday, she noticed a few students who had once whispered about her now gave her respectful nods. It wasn't anything overt, but it was enough. The classroom felt different, like the weight of judgment had lifted, even if just slightly. Alice wasn't one to seek attention, but the quiet acknowledgement was comforting. She slid into her usual seat, quietly unpacking her books as the lecture began. Professor Jensen entered. His usual brisk pace slowed just a little, a sign of something that had changed in him too. He began the lecture without his usual sarcasm, his voice calm and steady. As he discussed the complex concepts of quantum mechanics, Alice couldn't help but notice the way he occasionally glanced in her direction, not with the same dismissiveness as before, but with something akin to respect. The students noticed it too, exchanging curious looks as Alice remained focused on the lecture. By the time class was over, the usual rush to the door was slower. Several students lingered, packing their bags without the usual haste, and a few even came up to her, offering small, polite smiles or asking for help with a concept from the class. Alice had always been helpful to those who asked, but now it felt different. They weren't just asking because they had to. They were seeking her out, genuinely interested in her thoughts. As Alice walked through the campus later that afternoon, she couldn't help but reflect on what had happened. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to make such an impact with just one moment. But it wasn't just about solving that equation. It was about showing them that there was more to her than they had assumed. It was about proving to herself that she didn't have to hide her brilliance just to fit in. The realization felt liberating. Even as she made her way toward the quiet park bench she often sat at to clear her mind. That afternoon, she sat there for a while, watching the students pass by, all wrapped up in their own lives. It was hard not to think about how far she had come from the shy, reserved woman she had once been, the one who avoided confrontation and kept her head down. Now, she had a sense of peace that she hadn't felt before. She had found her voice, not in anger, but in quiet confidence. And for the first time in a long time, Alice felt like she was finally being seen, not just by others, but by herself. She knew that this moment wouldn't change everything. There would always be people who doubted her, but she also knew that she no longer had to prove herself to anyone. What mattered was that she had recognized her own worth, and that was the most important thing of all. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the campus, Alice stood up from the bench and walked back toward the dorms, a small smile on her face. She knew this was just the beginning, and for the first time in a long time, she was excited to see where this new chapter of her life would lead. It had been a few weeks since Alice's unforgettable moment in Professor Jensen's class, and life on campus had returned to its usual rhythm. But for Alice, everything had changed. She was no longer just the quiet woman who kept to herself. The students around her began to take notice, not just because of the incident in class, but because of something more subtle, something she had finally realized about herself. That realization was simple. She wasn't invisible. She didn't need to hide in the shadows to avoid judgment. She could stand out, be herself, and still be respected. That newfound confidence was beginning to change the way she interacted with the world around her. One afternoon, Alice found herself in the campus library, her usual quiet spot. She was browsing through a collection of journals when she noticed a group of students gathered in the corner, whispering and laughing. She didn't think much of it until one of the students, a familiar face from her calculus class, approached her. "Alice," the student said, a bit nervously. "I heard you're the one who solved that impossible problem in Professor Jensen's class. I've been struggling with some of the concepts, and I could really use some help." Alice looked up from her books and met the student's eyes. She could see the genuine request for help, not the dismissive attitude she had often seen before. A few months ago, she might have hesitated or brushed it off, but now, she saw this as an opportunity, not just to help someone else, but to embrace the person she was becoming. "Of course," Alice said, offering a small, reassuring smile. She motioned for the student to sit down beside her. "Let me show you a few tricks to make this easier." As she explained the concepts, Alice realized how far she had come. It wasn't just about the math. It was about the way she was finally comfortable sharing her knowledge and not hiding it in fear of judgment. She had spent so many years doubting herself, afraid that others would see her as too much or too little. But now, she understood that her voice, her ideas, and her intelligence mattered. The student listened intently, and after a few minutes, nodded in understanding. "Thanks, Alice. This makes so much more sense now. I'm really glad I asked." Alice smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her. This was what she had always wanted. Respect, not for who she tried to be, but for who she really was. As the student left, Alice returned to her books, but her thoughts drifted. This moment, this small exchange, meant more to her than just helping someone with homework. It was proof that she was no longer just a quiet observer in life. She was an active participant, contributing to the world around her in ways that mattered. Later that evening, as Alice walked through the campus, her mind continued to wander. She thought about the times she had felt overlooked or dismissed, and how she used to accept that without question. But now, she understood that she had the power to change her own narrative. She wasn't going to let anyone define her worth anymore. Not the professor, not the students, and certainly not her own doubts. Alice had stepped into a new chapter of her life, one where she no longer apologized for being who she was. As she walked through the bustling campus, a sense of peace washed over her. She didn't need to prove anything. She had already proven it to herself. It was another quiet morning on campus when Alice found herself walking across the familiar paths she had come to know so well over the past few months. She had settled into this routine of hers, balancing her studies, helping others when they asked, and most importantly, embracing the person she was becoming. The days of doubting herself were behind her. She had proven, not just to others, but to herself, that she was more than what anyone had ever thought her to be. As Alice made her way toward the library, her thoughts wandered to the events that had unfolded over the past few weeks. The way the students in her classes had started to interact with her differently, the small conversations after lectures, the way they no longer saw her as just the quiet woman in the back row, but as someone with valuable thoughts and ideas. It had been a gradual change, but one that felt significant. The campus had become a place where Alice felt she could truly exist, where she wasn't overlooked or dismissed. But it wasn't just the students who had noticed the shift. Alice had noticed it too. She had changed. She had stopped hiding. The past few days had brought new challenges, subtle yet meaningful. One of her professors had asked her opinion in class, something that would have seemed impossible just months ago. It wasn't a big moment, but it was a step in the right direction. The professor, a senior member of the department, had called on Alice to answer a question about a complex topic. Normally, Alice would have shrunk back, feeling the weight of the room's attention on her. But instead, she had answered, calmly and confidently. The room had gone silent for a moment, and then a few students had nodded, acknowledging her response. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Alice had learned something in that moment. She didn't have to fight for respect. It was already hers to claim. The next few days passed without incident, but Alice felt something stirring within her. She realized that the real challenge wasn't about proving her worth to others. It was about continuing to prove it to herself. She had spent so many years living in the shadows of her own self-doubt, but now, she was finally stepping into the light. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments when she questioned her choices, when she wondered if she was truly ready for the life she had started to build. But every time doubt crept in, Alice reminded herself of the moment in Professor Jensen's class. She had stood up, not just to him, but to all the expectations that had been placed on her. She had proven to herself that she was capable, that she had a voice that deserved to be heard. And with that, everything had changed. The evening of that week, Alice sat at her desk in the quiet of her dorm room, reflecting on everything that had brought her to this point. Her books were scattered around her, but her mind wasn't focused on them. She thought about how far she had come from the woman who had walked into that classroom months ago, unsure of herself and her place in the world. Now, she knew exactly who she was. And that, Alice realized, was the greatest victory of all. She didn't need to wait for anyone to give her permission to be great. She already was. As Alice walked across the campus that morning, a sense of contentment washed over her. It had been several weeks since she had made the decision to step into the light, to stop hiding and embrace her worth. The quiet, reserved woman she once was seemed like a distant memory now. She had grown in ways she never thought possible, and yet, there was still so much more to explore. The students she passed on her way to the library no longer saw her as the quiet one. They saw her for the person she was, intelligent, confident, capable. And while Alice hadn't actively sought their attention, it was hard not to notice the subtle shifts in how they interacted with her. A nod here, a smile there. A brief chat about classwork that quickly turned into a conversation about something more meaningful. It was small, these gestures, but they meant something. Alice had made her mark, not by force, but by simply being present, by showing up as her true self. She was finally allowing herself to be seen. As Alice entered the library, she noticed the usual hum of activity, the sound of pages turning, quiet conversations, the occasional clink of a coffee cup setting down on a table. It felt like her natural habitat, a place where she could lose herself in her studies, but also where she could take a moment to think. Sitting at her usual spot by the window, Alice opened her notebook and began to work on her latest assignment. The peaceful solitude of the library was the perfect environment for reflection. But as she worked, her thoughts drifted to a conversation she had had earlier that week. A fellow student, Emma, had approached her after class and asked if she could help with some research. Alice had been surprised at the request, but pleased to offer assistance. Emma had always been one of the more outspoken students, someone who seemed to have it all figured out. But as they sat together, Emma had shared that she often felt overwhelmed by the expectations placed on her, that despite her outward confidence, she sometimes questioned whether she was truly capable. That moment had struck Alice deeply. She had seen so much of herself in Emma, and it made her realize just how far she had come. Her own journey hadn't been easy, but it had shaped her into someone who no longer questioned her worth. It wasn't about being perfect or always having the answers. It was about believing in herself, trusting that she had something valuable to contribute. As Alice sat there, reflecting on this, she realized something else. Her journey wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. She had learned so much in these past months, but there was still more to discover about herself, about her passions, and about the world she wanted to impact. Alice had always been content to stay in the background, but now, she was ready to step forward, to take on the challenges that lay ahead. And for the first time, she felt excited about what the future held. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready to embrace it all, knowing that whatever came next, she had the strength and the wisdom to face it. As the afternoon sun streamed through the library windows, casting a warm glow over her desk, Alice smiled to herself. She had made it, and now, she was ready for whatever came next. The following weeks brought new opportunities for Alice, though they didn't come without challenges. Her newfound confidence was tested in ways she hadn't expected, but each time, she found herself rising to the occasion. One afternoon, while heading to a lecture, Alice was stopped by Professor Jensen. He was standing by the door of the classroom, looking somewhat uncomfortable, his usual air of confidence replaced by a more tentative posture. Alice hesitated, unsure of what to expect. Since their conversation in the hallway, things between them had been cordial, but there was still an unspoken distance. "Alice," Professor Jensen began, his voice more cautious than usual, "I've been thinking about the way I treated you earlier this semester. I owe you more than just an apology. I owe you recognition." Alice raised an eyebrow, surprised by his words. It wasn't like him to admit fault so openly. "Recognition for what?" she asked, genuinely curious. He looked down for a moment, gathering his thoughts before meeting her gaze again. "You didn't just solve that equation in class. You showed me something much more important. You showed me that I've been too quick to judge, that I've been overlooking people like you who have so much to offer." Alice could feel the weight of his words, but she wasn't sure how to respond. It wasn't every day that someone like Professor Jensen, someone who had always been so sure of himself, would admit to such a thing. "I appreciate that," Alice said softly, "but I didn't do it for you. I did it for myself." The professor nodded, as if that was exactly what he needed to hear. "Exactly," he said, his voice filled with a new kind of respect. "You've inspired me to take a closer look at how I interact with my students. I've been focusing too much on grades, on performance, without truly seeing the potential in everyone." Alice felt a sense of pride wash over her. It wasn't about proving something to him or anyone else. It was about knowing her worth, regardless of how others saw her. The conversation with Professor Jensen was a turning point, not just for their relationship, but for Alice's journey. She realized that the more she embraced who she was, the more others began to see her too. It wasn't about fitting into a mold or meeting expectations. It was about being authentic and allowing herself to grow. As Alice walked into the classroom that day, she noticed a subtle shift in the way the students interacted with her. They didn't just see her as the quiet woman in the back of the room anymore. They saw her as someone who had something valuable to contribute, someone who had earned their respect not by demanding it, but by quietly living her truth. The days passed, and Alice continued to find herself in new situations where her confidence was tested. She was asked to lead a group discussion in one of her seminars, a task that would have once terrified her. But this time, she embraced it. She wasn't the same person who had walked into the classroom months ago. She was someone who had learned the value of her own voice, of standing up and speaking out, not for the approval of others, but because she had something worth saying. The seminar went smoothly, and by the end of it, Alice was left with a feeling of accomplishment. It wasn't the applause or the recognition that mattered. It was the knowledge that she had done it for herself, that she had pushed past her fears and done something she once thought impossible. And for the first time, she truly believed in her own potential. That evening, as she sat in her dorm room reflecting on the day, Alice felt a deep sense of peace. She had come so far from the woman who used to hide in the background, afraid to be seen, afraid to stand out. She had learned that her worth wasn't determined by others. It was something she carried with her, something that could never be taken away. And in that moment, she realized that the journey she had started was only the beginning. The road ahead was full of possibilities, and she was ready to embrace them all. As the weeks passed, Alice continued to find herself stepping into new opportunities, each one pushing her further out of her comfort zone. She had become accustomed to the quiet confidence she had built, but life, as it often does, threw new challenges her way. One day, Alice received an invitation to a guest lecture being held in the auditorium by a prominent figure in her field. The speaker was renowned for his groundbreaking work, and the event was expected to draw a large crowd. Initially, Alice hesitated. It wasn't that she wasn't interested in the lecture. It was the idea of attending an event so public, so visible, that made her nervous. She had grown comfortable in the quiet spaces of the campus, the library, the small study rooms, the corners where she could disappear into the background. But this was different. This was an opportunity to learn, to grow, to be seen in a new way. She decided to go. On the day of the lecture, Alice found herself sitting in one of the middle rows, surrounded by students she didn't know. The room was full, and the energy was palpable. The speaker took the stage, and for the first time in a long time, Alice felt a sense of excitement that went beyond the usual academic interest. This was someone who had achieved great things, someone who had made an impact, and now, she was sitting in the same room, ready to learn from them. The lecture was engaging, thought-provoking, and filled with insights that left Alice reflecting on her own academic journey. But it wasn't just the content of the lecture that stayed with her. It was the realization that she, too, had something to offer. She had spent so long being the quiet one, the one who sat at the back of the room, avoiding attention. But now, she saw that there was value in her perspective. She didn't have to be a loud voice to make a difference. She could contribute in her own way, just as the speaker had. As the lecture came to an end, Alice found herself walking out of the auditorium with a new sense of purpose. She was no longer just a passive observer of the world around her. She was a participant, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized that her place in the world was not defined by anyone's expectations of her. It was defined by her own choices, by her willingness to step out of the shadows and into the light. The next day, Alice found herself facing another challenge. She had been invited to a small group discussion with some of the top students in her department. It was a casual gathering, but the idea of speaking up in front of such accomplished peers made her nervous. But this time, she didn't hesitate. She had learned enough to trust herself, to know that she belonged in that room. When it was her turn to speak, she did so with a clarity and confidence that surprised even her. She didn't try to impress anyone. She just spoke her truth, sharing her thoughts and ideas with the same authenticity she had come to value. The discussion flowed smoothly, and by the end of it, Alice felt a sense of pride. It wasn't about having the best ideas or getting the most attention. It was about contributing, being heard, and realizing that her voice mattered. As Alice walked back to her dorm that evening, She reflected on how far she had come. The shy, uncertain woman who had once hidden in the background was now stepping forward, taking opportunities and facing challenges head-on. And while there was still much to learn, Alice knew one thing for sure. She was ready for whatever came next. The days continued to pass, and Alice's transformation became more apparent not only to herself, but to those around her. She had grown more comfortable in her own skin, more confident in her voice, and her interactions with others reflected that change. The quiet, reserved woman who once hesitated to speak up was now someone who could walk into a room with a calm assurance, knowing her presence mattered. One afternoon, Alice was in the university cafe when she ran into Emma, the student who had once sought her help with a research problem. Emma waved her over, a wide smile on her face. "Alice, hey, I wanted to thank you again for helping me out the other day," she said as Alice joined her at the table. Alice smiled back, but before she could respond, Emma continued. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how we all have something valuable to offer, no matter what others think. It really stuck with me." Alice felt a warmth spread through her chest. It was moments like this that made her realize the impact of the changes she had made in herself. She hadn't set out to inspire anyone, but in doing so, she had helped Emma find a new sense of confidence. "I'm glad it helped," Alice said softly. "You've got a lot to offer, Emma. Sometimes, it's just a matter of trusting that you know more than you think." They continued chatting, and Alice was surprised at how natural the conversation felt. A few months ago, she would have been self-conscious, unsure of how to engage, but now, she was able to connect with ease. Later that week, Alice was invited to give a short talk in one of her seminars about a project she had been working on. She had worked diligently on the project, but the idea of presenting it in front of her peers still made her nervous. However, she was no longer the same person who had avoided the spotlight. She was ready to take this on. On the day of the seminar, Alice stood in front of the room, her heart pounding in her chest, but her hands steady. She knew her material, and she knew she was capable. As she spoke, her voice was calm and clear. The room listened intently, and Alice felt a sense of pride with every word that left her mouth. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment before a few students clapped, and the professor gave her a nod of approval. It wasn't about the applause. It was about Alice's realization that she had done it for herself. She had pushed past her doubts and fears to share her work. As Alice walked back to her seat, she felt a sense of accomplishment. The nerves she had felt before were gone, replaced by something much more powerful, a quiet, unshakable confidence. That evening, as she reflected on the day, Alice couldn't help but smile. She had come so far from the woman who once hid behind her doubts. Now, she stood tall, not because she had something to prove, but because she had nothing to hide. She was finally the woman she had always been meant to be, and she was ready for whatever came next. Weeks passed, and Alice's sense of self grew even stronger. She had embraced her voice, her worth, and the changes within her, but now there was a deeper understanding taking root. The feeling of being seen wasn't just about recognition from others. It was about her ability to appreciate herself and the strength she had cultivated. As the semester progressed, Alice found herself not only meeting challenges head-on, but seeking them out. She signed up for a leadership role in a student-run seminar, something that would have terrified her a few months ago. Yet, as she stood in front of the group, outlining the details of the upcoming session, she felt no fear. Instead, there was only a quiet confidence that had become second nature to her. It wasn't that she had conquered all her insecurities. They still lingered in moments of doubt. But she had learned to move through them, to acknowledge them, and then choose to act despite them. One afternoon, while preparing for the seminar, Alice received an unexpected email from one of her professors. It was an invitation to collaborate on a research paper, something Alice had never imagined herself doing. The professor, known for being extremely selective about his collaborations, had apparently taken notice of her work, and he wanted her perspective. At first, Alice hesitated. The weight of the invitation felt significant, and she questioned if she was truly ready for such an opportunity. But then, she remembered how far she had come, how she had started with nothing but quiet determination, and how she had pushed through moments of uncertainty. With that, Alice accepted the offer, knowing that this was another step toward her growth. Over the next few weeks, Alice immersed herself in the research project. The work was challenging, and there were moments when she felt out of her depth. But with each new section of the paper, she found herself gaining confidence in her own abilities. She began to realize that she didn't have to be perfect. She didn't have to have all the answers. She simply had to show up, put in the work, and trust that she was capable. As the project came to an end, Alice's professor praised her for her insightful contributions. The recognition was nice, but what truly mattered was the knowledge that she had earned it. She had proven, once again, that she was more than capable. One evening, as Alice reflected on the progress she had made, she realized that her journey wasn't about reaching a destination. It was about the small, everyday steps that led her to becoming the person she had always been meant to be. She was no longer the person who waited for opportunities to come to her. She was creating her own path. And for the first time, Alice truly believed in the life she was building, a life where her voice was heard, her worth was recognized, and her potential was limitless. The future no longer seemed uncertain. It felt like a promise, one that Alice was eager to fulfill. As the end of the semester approached, Alice felt a sense of fulfillment that she had never experienced before. The challenges she had faced over the past few months had shaped her into a person she was proud of, someone who no longer hesitated to speak her mind, someone who took on opportunities without second-guessing herself. Her transformation wasn't just about academic achievements or social recognition. It was about her inner growth. Alice had learned to trust herself, to embrace her strengths, and to accept her imperfections. The research paper she had worked on with her professor had been published in a prestigious academic journal, and that recognition felt like a tangible reward for her hard work. But for Alice, the real victory was in knowing that she had pushed herself beyond her comfort zone. She had stepped into a world that once seemed out of reach, and now it felt like she belonged. The night after the paper was published, Alice sat in her dorm room, reflecting on everything she had accomplished. She thought back to the quiet, uncertain woman she had been just a few months ago, the one who doubted her worth, the one who stayed in the background, afraid to take up space. Now, she saw a different version of herself, one who spoke confidently, who shared her ideas without fear, who embraced challenges with determination. Alice had found her voice, and she wasn't going to let it be silenced. As she looked out the window at the campus below, Alice felt a sense of excitement for what the future held. She didn't know exactly where her journey would take her, but for the first time, she didn't feel afraid to find out. She was ready for whatever came next. It wasn't just about the accolades or the recognition. It was about the person she had become. And as she sat there in the quiet of her room, Alice realized that the most important thing wasn't what she had accomplished, but who she had become in the process. She was no longer waiting for the world to recognize her. She had recognized herself. She had found her place, not in the shadows, but in the light, and she was ready to step into whatever came next with the same quiet strength that had carried her this far. The journey had only just begun. As Alice walked through the campus on a crisp, clear morning, she couldn't help but smile at how far she had come. It had been a few months since that transformative moment in the classroom, and now, everything felt different. The campus no longer felt like a place where she had to hide in the background. She had learned to carve out her space, to contribute to the conversations around her, and to recognize her own strength. Alice had always known that change was possible, but she had never imagined it could happen so quickly, so profoundly. She had found herself, not through the accolades or recognition, but through the quiet realization that she was enough, exactly as she was. As the semester drew to a close, Alice received a letter from a prestigious internship program she had applied to earlier in the year. She had almost forgotten about it, not because she wasn't interested, but because she had stopped waiting for external validation. When she opened the letter and saw that she had been selected, she felt a surge of pride, not because the achievement was impressive, but because she knew she had earned it on her own terms. This internship, much like everything else in her life now, wasn't a chance for someone else to give her worth. It was a step forward in her own journey, one that she was taking with confidence. The realization was simple. She was building a life that she had always dreamed of, not because of what others expected, but because she had finally decided to go after it. Alice had begun to learn the art of embracing the unknown, stepping into spaces that once intimidated her, knowing that she could handle whatever came her way. As the break between semesters began, Alice took some time to reflect on all she had accomplished. It wasn't just about the academic success or the projects she had been involved in. It was about the internal changes, the small moments when she had pushed past self-doubt and had chosen to be bold. She thought back to the time when simply raising her hand in class had felt like a monumental task, and now, she was standing at the threshold of an exciting new chapter. There was no doubt in her mind that she was ready. She had made peace with the fact that there would always be obstacles, always moments of uncertainty. But she had also learned that those moments didn't define her. They were just a part of the journey. Alice had stepped into her own power, and now she was ready to step into the world with the same quiet strength and determination that had carried her this far. As the new semester began and Alice prepared for her internship, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was only the beginning of a long, fulfilling journey, and she was ready to embrace it fully, with open arms and an open heart.